I'm going to pass you over to Bill. Bill, it's all yours.
Thanks very much, Len, and thank you all, everybody, for coming along this evening to this talk. I think before we talk about our local history, we're going to say a few words about the history of the postcard itself. Now, you probably all recognise a penny black, the first British postage stamp, first postage stamp in the world, issued in 1840 following Rowland Hill's great reform of the postal system in 1839. So a world first, the penny black and the twopenny blue. But we certainly weren't the first with postcards. We talked about them and never got on with it. And so we were beaten to it by Austria-Hungary, who produced the first postcard. And as you can see, you don't really have to read German to know that says correspondence card. And that was produced in October 1869. And that finally kicked the British Post Office into action. And a year later, we did our own. And this is the first type of postcard from 1870. Now, there's a lot to say about the design of this. First of all, it was very small. It's only 4 3/4 inches by 2 7/8. The postage was only a halfpenny instead of a penny on a letter, but it doesn't have a stamp. It's pre-printed, as you can see. There's a post office monopoly. No one else can produce these. There's no image. You would write the address on one side and you write your message on the other side. So it's a very limited sort of thing, but incredibly popular because it was only a halfpenny. If you had a quick message to send, it cost you half the postage of a letter. Of limited interest to historians in the sense that you'll be lucky if you find something of interest in the message, and actually finding them can be quite difficult. The design changed quite a lot over the years, including getting bigger, but that's really only of interest to postal historians and philatelists. But at last, not until 1894 did we get to a picture postcard. And still, you had this very great limitation that the picture had to be on one side and the address on the other. So any message had to be fitted in, as it were, around the picture. And so that was still a limitation. But you'll notice this has got a real stamp on it. By now, they could be privately produced and they could be sent by putting an adhesive stamp. But we finally get to where we want to be in 1901 with the modern style of postcard, which people call, for obvious reasons, the divided back, where you write the address and the correspondence on one side on one side of the card, and the other side has the full image. And so this is the point from which postcards start to get very, very interesting. There are fundamentally two production methods. One is a real photograph, and you get very high definition, and you can do a lot of interesting things with them, which you'll see in a minute. Others are printed, litho printed or whatever else, and they obviously give far lower definition and are more limited in what you can discern in the picture. Sources, there were big postcard companies producing them in great quantity, but also a lot were produced by small local firms. This was an era when there was a sort of photographer on every street corner practically. I've listed in Brixton alone over 70 different photographers working from the late Victorian times into World War I. And a lot of them would produce their own postcards. And how popular were they? Well, here's a picture of, on the left, Brixton Road, and you'll see there's a kiosk, and that's outside where the tube station would be today. And although this is a somewhat faded sepia card, it is a real picture, a real photo card. And so you can scan it at high resolution, you can enlarge parts of it, and you can see here the little postcard shop. That's how popular they were. You had a whole shop selling nothing but postcards. And that was actually run on behalf of or by a man called Lang Sims, who was a very interesting local character. He was in turn a councillor and alderman, twice mayor of Lambeth, and apparently quite a character. I've got to do some more research on his history. The postcard usage really declined after the First World War, and there's a lot of discussion about why, but some of the reasons certainly include the printed ones that I was telling you about. A lot of them were actually printed in Germany. I mean, the postcards were so popular that it would pay you to take a photograph locally somewhere and send a negative off to Germany and get them to print a load of cards and send them back and sell them. And of course, that stopped as soon as the war started. Post-war, there were more cheaper communications coming on board. People started to get hold of the telephone. The other interesting thing was the postage doubled in 1918 to a penny. The original penny post from 1840 stayed at a penny right the way to 1918, and the halfpenny post from 1870 stayed at a halfpenny right the way to 1918. But of course, by the end of the war, getting towards the end of the war, the country was broke, and this was a government monopoly. It was post office was part of the government, part of the treasury, and they increased the penny post to a penny halfpenny and the postcard post to a penny, so it was no longer as cheap. And of course, the other great interest in postcards for people was, of course, the image. And although roll film had been invented sometime earlier, it was really only in the 1920s, when you got cameras like the Box Brownie becoming cheap and popular, that people could take their own photographs, and so the image became, less of a thing. You can take your own. Of course, postcards didn't die out. We still see them today. But the golden era, the real period when you can find a postcard of more or less any street in the country if you look hard enough, that golden era really is that what we can loosely call the Edwardian period, from the turn of the century to the First World War. So what sort of things are potentially of interest in postcards? Well, obviously, the image. St Gabriel's College in Cormont Road, for instance, and of course that's still there. You can go and look at it. What this does show you is the alterations that have been done to it. But one of the nice things, of course, is when you can find postcards showing the inside in its heyday, when it was a teacher training college, and we can see there, the dining room and the library, and fascinating as well, the laboratory. I don't know whether you ever remember this in chemistry at school. You can see there's a fume cabinet. There's the vent, and you do the smelly experiments or dangerous smells in there. Pull down that shutter, and you just let the pollution out into the air. So that's the sort of thing that helps illustrate what the building was used for, that you won't get. You can see the people. This was taken from 1906. Some of the class of 1906, but it wasn't to last. Here is St Gabriel's College, now called the First London General Hospital, because it was taken over by the government in the war, and the signs of that are clearly there. You can see a Red Cross next to the Union flag. There's police, there's uniformed people, and here are some of the people that ended up there. But I suppose they're the lucky ones. They did at least come back from the front. So it enriches our knowledge of the building that is still there with the other things that we can see. But what about the buildings that are no longer there? This is even better. This is Spurgeon's Orphanage in Stockwell. That opened in 1869 on the site which is now occupied by the Planetus College. It's sort of behind Clapham Road by Stockwell Park Road. And that was thriving right up until the beginning of the Second World War. It was evacuated, of course, in 1939. And after the war, it was used for a little while, but they opened a new home in Kent in 19 51, and that was the end of this building. And it is grand. I mean, look at it. But then, you know, Spurgeon was never knowingly understated. But again, the images of who were there, these are, to a certain extent, one would expect sort of propaganda. The orphan choir and handbell ringers and the gymnasts. And it was girls as well as boys there. And we see them doing some sort of pageants or whatever. Perhaps this view is a little bit more realistic. The picture at the top there shows rather a crowded dormitory with bare floorboards and Spurgeon looking down on them severely across the room. This is another bit of local history. This memorial you can see here by George Tinworth. He was one of the great ceramicists working at the Dalton Lambeth factory, which of course was up by the river just behind where the fire brigade headquarters is. Well, it's not the headquarters anymore, but that fire brigade headquarters building. And this right-hand plaque on this memorial represents the orphanage, and the left-hand plaque here represents the Spurgeon Tabernacle, the facade of which you can still see at the Elephant and Castle, although it was rebuilt behind. So Spurgeon's was a total loss, but we've also got things that have survived but have been much altered. And this is the famous Electric Avenue in Brixton, named obviously because it was the first shopping street to be lit by electricity. And again, you can see wonderful detail in these sorts of images. There's another one, and it will blow up nicely. You can really look down there, and you can read Robinson's American Teeth Institute. But Winston and Newton's artist material, as far as I know, is still going strong, aren't they? I think. And this is one of the nice things. If you get a real photograph of showing shops and that sort of thing, you can really zoom in and see a lot of detail. Electric Avenue really knew how to do Christmas. This is how it was decorated. The really interesting one to me, the one on the right, is from 1909. And they've got this sort of model mock-up aeroplane. And people are climbing this ladder to get up into it to be photographed. 1909, Blériot hasn't even flown the Channel yet. It's a year before that happened. And they're using this mock-up plane as a Christmas decoration in 1909. And of course, all around the borough, all around London, all around the country, one of the things we've lost huge numbers of are pubs. This particular one, the corner of Lothian Road and Langton Road, the Lothian Arms. And we lost it for what? Well, this is what's there today. We should get out on our bikes and see it, I suppose, but because we can be lazy and do it on Google Street View. And the houses on the side there are obviously just the same as we saw in the photo of over a century earlier, but the pub has gone to this. So moving on, the other thing we've certainly lost in Brixton are theatres. We had two. The Brixton Theatre itself, there's a view down. There's the Ritzy Cinema, which still exists in the Tate Library. There's the theatre entrance. The only thing that survives of it is the foundation stone, because the theatre opened in 1896 and it was bombed in the Blitz in the war in 1940. And it's always amusing if we take people for a walk there. You can show the foundation stone and say that the theatre was between the Ritzy and the Tate, and they say, well, there's not room for a theatre. Well, no, that was the entrance, and the main theatre is tucked up behind there. Our other theatre, Theatre of Varieties, musical effectively, was the Empress on the corner of Brighton Terrace and Bernays Grove, for people that know the area. That's the same sort of era. It opened in 1898. had a major remodeling and reopened in 1931 in an Art Deco style. That survived the war and was reborn as a Granada cinema in 1957. But unfortunately, it really didn't make it. And in 1992, it was finally demolished. And there's a little block of flats there now. So there's a lot we can see about lost buildings with postcards. Whenever a new means of communication emerges, there's two groups that you can guarantee will quickly take advantage: the politicians that we'll come to later, and advertisers. So we can segue from theatre buildings into theatre advertising. And here's a postcard from the Brixton Theatre to advertise a production in 1917. The Brixton Theatre was a repertory theatre, essentially. It largely did straight plays, but they weren't averse, of course, to a nice pantomime to pack them out at Christmas. And here you've got Cinderella and an idea of what a grand theatre it was and what they could stage. The next advertising card is also theatrical, from the Empress. And I threw this one in a bit particularly because, as we all know, one source is always very limited. And what really builds up a picture is when something gives you a clue and then you start looking in other places and putting things together. And one of the things you noticed here, the Empress Theatre, Florrie Ford, and you can easily look her up on Wikipedia and find out about her, but she was there on Monday, November the 21st. Well, November the 21st, which year? Very common with ephemera of all sorts that no one bothers to put the year in. So one of the things that is a very useful tool, of course, is a perpetual calendar. And if you haven't got one, Google it and download one off the internet. You easily get one for free. And then you can work out in which years the 21st of November fell on a Monday. And other clues, I mean, look at her style of dress. That's got to be surely post First World War, probably pre the second one. Let's say it's the 20s or the 30s. Interestingly, the use of the swastika there as a symbol of good luck, not in any way promoting the Nazis. So we've got a number of clues. Another resource we go to is then the British Newspaper Archive, and you can access that online, although if you do it privately, you've got to have a subscription. And you can then quickly find a review of this in the Era newspaper, which was, devoted to this sort of thing, the theatre and cinema, 23rd of November, 1927. So we tie that down and we start to build up a bigger picture. Interesting, the printer here, Waddington's. Waddington's, that's famous, of course, for Monopoly. But when you look them up, they actually started out as a specialist in printing for the entertainment industry. And they only got into the games market in the 1920s. Now, those cards were designed to be sent out to advertise what was going on, as it were. This is the sort of card that would be given away, and you would hope that people would send it back. So this is for obviously, as a Sunlight Laundry in Acre Lane. Not certain of the date of that, but this opened in 1937, so this probably is in the 1930s. And a lovely Art Deco building that is still there, obviously in a different use. And so some cards, as I say, were given away to be sent back. Another thing you get from postcards is simply, look, Cheltenham Works in Acre Lane. You see such a variety of advertising cards that you realise how much more of a mixed economy we had in throughout Lambeth, throughout London, with any number of small firms doing all sorts of stuff, engineering and all sorts of things in the local area. And that's really all gone today. I'm afraid. It's a shame in some ways. Notice the postmark, British Empire Exhibition, 1923. This is a really quirky card. I had to put this one in just because it is so odd. It's First World War. They don't mention Brow, but it is Brow. But the weird thing is, when you look at this insert here, is obviously not the card. That is standard Braille. And what's here shown as a blind alphabet is a mirror image of it. And the idea was you could put that card showing the blind alphabet over a piece of paper or other card, put a pin through the holes, and that would create holes in the card underneath, which were raised behind. So, of course, then if you turn it round and feel it from the back, where the pin's gone through and caused a bit of a raise, you'll be reading ordinary Braille. So the idea of this card was to let ordinary people write a simple message in Braille to someone who was blind. Whether it ever took off or whether anybody ever used it that way, it sounds terribly complicated to get it all lined up and actually make it work so that a visually impaired or blind person could actually read it. I really don't know. But it's amazing the weird and wonderful things that you do find on postcards. I already mentioned shops, and here's some examples of shops. And again, tremendous detail. I don't know how much you can see on your screens. A lot will depend on how big a screen you've got, obviously. But if you get a high resolution scan of these and you've got a big screen, you can really go in and read the things that are in the windows, and you can get an idea of what they were selling. Very often you can see the prices of things. Francis and Sons there, that is in Loughborough Road. It's 60A, but it's not 60A now, that building. It's because of renumbering. That's a thing you've got to watch out for, street renumbering. It's now a cafe. Tuxford and Brown there on the right, that's in Acre Lane. Off to the archives, track it down in Kelly's directory, find out where it is. Lovett Stores, 219 Clapham Road. I'm not sure if there's been renumbering there. I must admit, confess, I haven't checked that one. If it's still 219, then that is right next to the Swan Pub, opposite the tube station. Isn't that wonderful? Look at that lantern. China Glass and Earthenware Stores. So for a fortune today, that was an antique, wasn't it? Early days of cars. Hire this car in Brixton. The Napier car was actually made in Lambeth from 1903 to 4. The one below it, Unique, was a French car. They specialised in taxis from 1905. But you can see here the card was produced in Stockwell, and of course the owner of this car is making money out of it by hiring himself out in his car as a chauffeur. This is a wonderful card, Howard Wilson's in Acre Lane. Wilson still exists as a firm, no longer local, of course, but that image at the top there looks just post First World War, doesn't it? You know, you can imagine a number of people that have, after the war, got together and there we are. He calls himself a motor instructor, but there's obviously a lot of engineering going on there. The image below isn't the postcard. It's from a cutting from the Auto Car magazine, different sort of ephemera. There's a whole talk could be given about other sorts of ephemera, but that's not for tonight. This was on the corner of Acre Lane and Trinity Gardens, opposite Tesco's. That's been rebuilt now, and that's where the British Heart Foundation places on the ground floor. This wonderful sign was a neon sign. I don't know what happened to it when it was demolished, but you can still sometimes see this logo. That company still exists, and we know they started in Brixton in Lambeth all that time ago. But a card like this tells you a lot about the times. Loughborough Road chemists. I'm quite fascinated by the Victorian era, Edwardian era, I should say, because so much of the buildings and the infrastructure still exists. So when you look at the postcards and look at the images, so much of it is totally recognizable. But then when you focus in, you see how totally different life was. So, you know, it's a favorite time of mine, but I wouldn't want to live there. And look at this. I mean, honestly, this liquid caseline, highly recommended for vermin in children's heads, destroys bugs, ants, earwigs, and vermin on animals. And the recommendation for this one on the right here, it's the best rat destroyer I've ever used, and they do not smell afterwards. Doesn't sound like the world I'd like to live in. But as I say, postcards still exist. This one's from, on the left is 1996. The Ritzy Cinema and its sister cinema then, the Gate, advertising the famous or infamous film Trainspotting. And just to close on this section, the one on the right, the only indication that there's a local connection is that it's Lang Sims again. It's produced it, Lang Sims, photographer. And you think, well, given that there are photographers everywhere, if it's a local photographer, it's likely to have some local connection. And indeed, a bit of research turns out that this particular actress, Vera de Meersden's manager, lived in Atherfold Road in Stockwell. So I mentioned politicians. The constituency boundaries, of course, have changed over the years, and they're likely to change again soon, apparently. Brixton was a constituency in its own right from 1885 until the 1974 boundary changes, and this chap Baggerley was the first MP. He only lasted 2 years. He resigned because he wanted to become a stipendiary magistrate. Nowadays, of course, they just do that as a second job. This one is quite interesting. This was from the 1887 by-election after Baggerley resigned, and it's prompting you to vote for somebody called Hill. That didn't work. Carmarthen won it. Carmarthen's odd name. He was the Marquis of Carmarthen, the eldest son of the Duke of Leeds. The title Marquis is an honorary title. It doesn't entitle people to a seat in the House of Lords. And so Carmarthen became the MP. But he held the seat in the 1892 election. But in 1895, his father died, and he became the Duke of Leeds, which immediately sent him to the House of Lords. He couldn't be in both houses at once. And that caused the by-election. There's an interesting coda to this. This is not really local history, but I find it an interesting bit of history. I'm sure most of you remember Tony Benn. And whatever you think about him, he did bring about a fundamental change to the British Constitution. He became an MP in 1950. His father was also a Labour politician, but between the wars, he was made Viscount Stansgate to boost Labour's representation in the House of Lords. And his eldest son, who wasn't Tony, was set to inherit the title in the fullness of time. But he, Tony Benn's older brother, was in the RAF and was killed in the war. So in November 1960, the Viscount Stansgate, Tony Benn's father, died, and Ben automatically became a peer, and he couldn't sit in the House of Commons anymore. So effectively, they threw him out. There was a 1961 by-election. By a quirk of electoral law, he could stand, and he did, and he won it overwhelmingly. And the electoral authorities said, no, it doesn't count, and they gave the seat to the runner-up, who was a Tory. And incidentally, he was also an heir to a peerage. He wouldn't have lasted longer than his father. So outside Parliament, Ben campaigned against this, and within 2 years, the Conservative government introduced the Peerage Act of '63, which allowed for the disclaimer of peerages. Not such a problem today because we have the life peerage that isn't passed on, but there was no such thing when Viscount Stansgate was created. They didn't come in until '58. And what was really interesting was we're talking about, some of the morals of our politicians today. The Conservative who got the seat but by default and knew he wasn't entitled to it, when this Act of Parliament came into force that enabled people to disclaim their peerages, Ben was the first to use it and disclaimed his peerage within half an hour of the Act coming into force. And the man who got his seat, Sinclair, honourably did the right thing and resigned from Parliament, creating another by-election which Tony Benn won. So if you didn't know that story, you can pick it up. This that moustache belongs in the House of Lords, isn't it? This is a one of these nice linkages. Dalziel won the 1910 election and remained until 1927, when he was then offered a peerage, which he took, but he kept it in the family. His nephew then got the seat and kept it until 1945, when Marcus Lipton won it in the Labour post-war landslide. But there's an interesting connection. Dalziel founded the General Motor Cab Company, and that had its first premises at the in Brixton Road at the Kennington end, right at the top, behind the Kennington Church, number 1 Brixton Road, which is now the Kennington Park Business Centre. But here we see it in all its glory, with those early cabs coming out, and this MP founded that. Local politics also get represented. Lambeth Ratepayers League, 1873. When we still had the vestry system, of course, we hadn't got proper local government then. A campaign against any increase in the rates, burdens and schemes. Frederick Honey was a bit of a local character. His name went down in a court case, Hamilton versus Honey, that he won, and he was able to build over Stockwell Green, which is where I live. And interestingly, Hamilton versus Honey is still sometimes quoted in the courts as a lead case on the nature of greens, village greens. Talking of politics, pubs, the George Canning, obviously is named after Canning, if you know him. He was a British politician. After a long and varied career, he finally made it to Prime Minister, but he only lasted 4 months before he died. Weird character, his great rival Castlereagh, and he actually fought a duel in 1809. It's unbelievable, especially as they were on the same side. They were both members of the same cabinet. But what is interesting is this pub is still there, of course. If you don't know the area, it's now called the Hootenanny, but that building is still there. What has disappeared is his statue, and it's a bit of a local mystery. No one knows who the statue is and where it's gone. Is it of George Canning? It could well be. There is a statue of Canning in Parliament Square, but this certainly isn't a copy of it, because it looks different to that. And this is one of our local mysteries, and no one knows where that's gone. If anybody does, answers to Lambeth Archives. We move on. I'm going to start talking about the war, but something by way of a prelude. So much I could show you, and I can't for time. 1908, Lambeth Town Hall was opened, and there's any number of images of the fantastic crowds that turned out for the Prince and Princess of Wales who came to open it. But I'm choosing to show this image, which is them after the opening, leaving and going up Brixton Road, heading north back up to wherever they lived. And they're going just past Sanders there, which is now where the Costa Coffee is, under the railway bridge. just opposite the tube station. And the interesting thing about this is look at the lack of protection. They're in this open landau being drawn along and these cheering crowds, and they've got no idea what's in store. This is 1908, and of course in 1914, another crown prince and princess in an open landau was shot, and those were the shots that started the First World War in Sarajevo. And once it started, there was recruitment. And here's a recruitment tent set up outside the entrance to Electric Avenue here, you can just see on the right. And again, you can see tremendous detail here. It's the poster there for the 1st Surrey Rifles, and they're signing up. This poster says something about Belgium. Britain, your country needs you. And here they are signing up for the war. This has got to be one of the most boring postcards out, but it's again, it's what it tells you. German prisoners compound. Message on the back to someone in Holman Road just says, "Dear Doll, getting on all right down here and in the best of health. Best wishes, Jim." But down here, Frimley in Surrey, was where the first German POW camp and enemy alien internment camp was set up in September 1914. It didn't last long because it was a camp. I mean, you can see here tents. They were being kept in tents. And when the winter really set in, it wasn't viable, and something more permanent was done. But you know, internment, of course, of enemy aliens. Here's an image from Milkwood Road, and you can see the hairdresser and perfumier, Munich, German name, and in the anti-German riots that took place, the whole frontage has been smashed in. Here's another image of a shop. This was owned by somebody called Schmidt, and this is in Landau Road, on the corner of K Road. It's now just a house. Again, you know, I've researched the name, the story behind it. He was interred on the Isle of Man, made bankrupt, and look what they've done here. Sorry, moved on. This is all whited out. I don't think they've painted that out. What they've done is they've blackened it out on the negative and reprinted the postcard so it doesn't show his German name. Completely disowned. And Hovis, the brand, and you can see all the bread and the details. There are loads and loads and loads of cards like this, photographs of men about to go off to the war, and the only indication very often of who the some local connection is just who the photographer was. But this one has a contemporary note on the back of who his name is, and of course then you can look them up and you find that he died, and you can get the commemoration from the War Graves Commission, and here he is, 2nd Battalion Coldstream Guards, died at just 19, someone from Fairmount Road. And you'll find any number of cards like this, and if you can identify the person, you can find out what happened to them. Ordinary cards were sent during the war, of course. This one's actually just after the war, it's 1919, but still it's on active service. There's no stamp there, and you see it's an Army Post Office cancellation, and it's been censored, sent back to Brixton. And there was always even room for humour. Again, someone's written on there on active service, there's no stamp, censored. Who says we're not gaining ground? Donald McGill, of course, who later became famous for his saucy seaside postcards, if you think they're saucy. And postcards were sent in the Second World War. This is from a prisoner of war back home to Stockwell. And it's passed by German censors and by the British censors. and there he is, he's camped. It is now over 4 years since I saw you. I must admit, I reckon you're kind of missing my wit and slovenly habits. I'm a bit fed up with cooking, so I propose to come home soon. We still had a bit of a wait. It's 1944. But again, you know, you can research the families, you can track the histories from this starting information. This one I haven't researched enough yet. This is very unusual. It's 1944, written from Lambeth to Paris. Obviously after its liberation, obviously censored. Haven't quite deciphered all the handwriting yet, but you will no doubt be surprised to learn that I was repatriated on the 17th of September from our camp at Gironde, I think. I've got to finish translating that properly and researching it. I don't think postcards ever tell you a full story, but they can set you off on one and take you into some interesting stories. And here's a wonderful example. I came upon this by almost by accident. It's obviously a grave. Doesn't look as though it's anywhere in Lambeth. It's pretty open there behind. It's a bit easier to read if you've got some good software that you can mess about with the images. And you'll see this one later on as well. But here we've just twisted it around so we can read it more easily. In loving memory of Frank Lewis Hemming, husband of Albertina of Brixton, London. Died February 1949. Perhaps he died in the flu pandemic after the First World War. But also of Lewis George Hemming, petty officer, only son who fell in the Battle of Jutland. So we can soon look him up. And yes, indeed, he's commemorated on the Chatham Navy Memorial. He went down with his ship in that first great, well, really the only great surface sea battle of the First World War. And he's commemorated on that gravestone. That actually makes that gravestone a war memorial. I keep meaning I've got to flag this to the Imperial War Museum for their database, because they do show gravestones. If the person's buried there, it's not a war memorial, it's a war grave. But if it commemorates someone who's not buried there, it's a war memorial. And they would count that as a war memorial. But where was it? Where was that? There's a bit of a mystery. And I pointed out there was another little stone at the back, and pulled that up and been able to read it more closely. In memory of this lady, beloved wife of a reverend. Well, a reverend, we can find him in Crockford's. Oh yes, Reverend of Stour Provost, Rector Gillingham, Dorset. So we check again on the burial records, and sure enough, Frank Lewis was buried there at that place in Dorset. So why? He came from Brixton. Well, the answer was the census of 1911 tell us. And there's Frank with Albertina and their daughter. The son isn't there. He was 25 when he was killed. He was already in the Navy before the war. But we look, both of these parents came from the West Country. He was born in Bath. Albertina was born in Gillingham, Dorset. So she lost her son in the war. She lost her husband just after the war. She had him buried back where she was born, with the intention of joining him in the fullness of time. And in fact, she did. She's buried there as well. So from one postcard, you get a whole history. From human disasters to natural disasters, fires. This is a bit of a nonsense, of course. That's been all dubbed in. The fire took place late at night, and they certainly didn't have any photographs of it actually happening. But there's plenty the next day. And again, you have to look closely at these things and find other stories that are in them. Morley and Lansley. Morley's now still there, opposite the tube station. But look, this is Morley and Arnsley, this is Morley and Arnsley, and in between you've got the London Gloucestershire Dairy. And it's telling you how shops like this develop. They weren't built as department stores. They bought up individual units, merged them together. Obviously later they got that one, merged it together, and that's how that store built up. This is Lang Sims again, local photographer we talked about earlier, showing the aftermath of the fire. This is a wonderful photograph. Look at that car. I mean, this is a real traffic stopper. This is a view from behind in Bernays Grove. And again, you need to look closely and look in some of the detail. And we'll bring up a couple of points here. There's the photographer, another photographer caught by another local photographer, size of the kit he's using. And here you can see a word, Imperial. Well, I checked that in the directories. It's Imperial Chemical Industries. There was a paint store there. And those of you who know the area, Bernays Grove, just opposite that paint store was the Empress Theatre that you've already seen. If that fire had spread that far and the paint store had gone up, I don't know what would have happened to the Empress. Of course, a big fire like that was reported in the South London press, off to Lambeth Archives. You look it up, you find out the details. I found an interesting story. The fire broke out about midnight. And one of the things the press says is, fortunately, although there were lots of people in bed at the time and they all got out safely, none were injured. Now, what do you mean there were people in bed? This was a department store. Because it led me into a whole story that I didn't know. Perhaps a lot of you do know about it. But a story about shops, the system called living in, where a lot of the shop workers lived in rooms in the attic above the shop. And I found out a lot about that from the website of the Shop Workers Union, ASDOR. It did become quite an exploitative system because they got their food and keep. They could be paid quite very, very low wages and can get sort of trapped by the system. And it's one of the things that the Shop Workers Union fought against. And it carried on even past the First World War, but eventually, of course, they got it out. There was another fire that same year just further up the road, Wallace Hughes Drapery. And it does actually say at the bottom of the printed card there, fatal fire. On one of these cards, it says, this is where poor girl jumped to her death. Death, inquest, archives, South London Press, and you read the whole story. All sorts of accusations were thrown about. It's unbelievable. Was it a fraud? Was it arson? Whatever. The only interesting thing that somebody blamed it on, so many fires taking place in these draper stores, was the amount of celluloid collars that they were stocking. That sounds bizarre, but I mean, if any of you know anything about celluloid, the early celluloid was terribly inflammable. About the only thing it's ever used for today are ping pong balls. If you ever fancy trying an experiment, don't do it indoors. You take one out somewhere safely and put a light to it and whoosh, it go up. So maybe that was something to do with it. So where did the brave firemen come from? Fire station in Brixton. The first one was just around the corner from there in Ferndale Road. The building is still there. It's been recently revamped, and it's got a coffee shop and other things in it. Wonderful as Lambeth Archives are, of course, they're not the only archive. The London Fire Brigade's got its own archive, and I got hold of the full details of this building and information about when it was built, what it cost to build, and what the complement of men and machines were. And here they are, it's what they call a turnout. And if you've got a fire station anywhere in your area, somewhere you'll be able to find a postcard like this of a turnout. That's what they called them, where they all came out the front and all lined up to be photographed. And you can find them right across London, anywhere. Moustaches couldn't have actually been compulsory because two of them don't have moustaches. but there are the brave lads. Of course, that's not where the fire station is today. Funny enough, it was the same year as the fires, and I'm not sure exactly when one closed and the other opened. This is Brixton's. There it says new fire station. It's still there today in Gresham Road, and here's a turnout from Gresham Road with this very much the same crew. Apart from the appliances, it looks very much the same today. So I've rather galloped through that, and it's still taking the best part of an hour. But I hope I've shown that the postcards can be a very interesting resource if you just use them very much as a starting point. They tip you off about things. You think, oh, what's that about? What's going on there? And it can set you off on a course of tracking down a family history, finding out about, you know, the history of shopping and all sorts of stories. And as I said, in that golden age of postcards, you can find a card of virtually anywhere in the country. And so this can be found. My examples are, of course, from Brixton, because that's where I'm from, but you can find them from all over Lambeth. So if you want to come back, Len, that's me done for now. I can try and answer any questions if you think there's time. Have I sent Len to sleep?
No, he's here. Sorry, someone's got in the way through. Thank you very much, Bill. As you say, a fantastic springboard for stories that you get clues to follow up, and some fantastically informative local examples. I think there's a small enough crowd amongst us to be able to take questions just orally. So if anyone's got a question, if you just want to unmute yourself, say who you are, and fire away. I won't record the question, so I shall turn the recording off now.